I know I can't talk forever. Okay, so 3 stories from my research, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about pastoral care through this framework that I mentioned, and then talk about some implications for all this, for what it might mean for people like you and me in churches and in ministry contexts. But I want to start on a slightly more gloomy note, and that is the situation in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in terms of our religious affiliation and church attendance. Because as you've probably observed, the number of people attending churches around the country has declined, and the number of people affiliated with Christianity has also declined. The top graph shows the percentage of Christians from the census data, percentage of people in the New Zealand population who said they were Christians. And that kind of sat around 90% for a very long time, through until the early 1970s, really. So if you were born before 1956, which I suspect that many of you might have been, you were born into a world, into a country where 90% of the people in New Zealand stated that they had a Christian religious affiliation. If you were born in around 1971 like I was, that had dropped to 85%. And at the last census in 2018, the proportion was right down to 38%. So that's a massive difference, isn't it, in terms of the number of people who state in affiliation with the Christian faith. At the same time, the number of people with no religious affiliation has been increasing, and the number of people of other religions has kind of been pretty stable, with a little bit of an increase. So that's kind of the context that we're in, and our world has changed. There's been these processes of secularization, of change that have that mean that the world that we're in today is a whole lot different than it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And of course, the other context that's really important for us at the moment is COVID, and this ongoing reality of and all the difficulties that it brings, both in terms of personal health and our ability to meet together, plus some of the issues that are going on at a more subterranean level in terms of misinformation being spread, disinformation being spread, people protesting, a whole lot of things that are not ideal in our world. And so that's our context, which is a little bit bleak. But let me tell you some happy stories to cheer us back up again. Teddy bears, they're happy stories. The bear on the left, that's Wild Bear. That's my teddy bear from when I was a child, with its carefully crocheted poncho. I think my gran might have made Wild Bear's poncho for me. You used to be able to wind Wild Bear up and he'd play Brahms's lullaby as I went to sleep, and that was always pretty special. So Wild Bear is still a very special friend of mine, and came out in 2020 when it was the beginning of lockdown, and just wanted to have a photo taken on my office chair with my keyboard, because Wild Bear was keen to get in on the act of teddy bears in windows. Did anybody put a teddy bear in their window? Yep, okay. So that was a pretty neat initiative that happened throughout the country and throughout the world. And here in New Zealand, the Facebook group We're Going on a Bear Hunt New Zealand was created on the 23rd of March 2020, inspired by a similar initiative that was taking place overseas. A woman called Annalie Scott from Hamilton established the group, hoping, she wrote, to help entertain our little ones and our not-so-little ones too, while we're dealing with being in self-isolation. Okay, now some of you told me that you put teddy bears in windows. How many looked for teddy bears in windows? Yeah, I think everyone was looking for teddy bears in windows. Little ones and not-so-little ones. We were all interested. By the end of 2020, the Facebook group had over 20,000 members, and it had inspired and recorded numerous teddy bear-related escapades. And as well as providing children and the young at heart with the entertainment of searching for and discovering bears when they were out walking, this initiative also provided a significant platform for connecting. At its most basic level, some measure of connection occurred as people placed their teddy bears in windows and as neighbours, friends and strangers walked past their house and noticed them. But the connection didn't stop there, because some bears, or perhaps their owners, shared photos of their adventures on the Facebook page. And that encouraged locals to visit, to see the antics that the bears were up to, but it also encouraged others who were far away to just enjoy what they were seeing in these stories in the Facebook group. So Facebook provided a platform where people could like and comment and share these things, share posts, share stories of bears having adventures. They attracted messages of affirmation and appreciation, and people sent gifts, which are little animated electronic things that like wave or give a heart or something, sending love and hugs. One of the things that really interested me about this initiative, though, was the extent to which it wasn't about consuming. It wasn't about me thinking, right, I'm going to go and enjoy looking at the teddy bears in the windows around and near me. I wanted to contribute to that. I wanted to participate, to be involved in that as well. It required participation. The Great New Zealand Bear Hunt wasn't something that this person who started it, Annalie, could have done alone. It required people like Mary and Susan and Deb, who staged and posted adventures. And it was enhanced by spouses and grandparents and who painted and built and videoed. And it was strengthened by people like Lissy, who wrote that she was really gutted that she had nowhere to put a bear for the bear hunt because her house was in a back section. So instead she painted a bear on her letterbox. And so people were wanting to be involved in this. They were wanting to participate, not just to consume. And I think these examples serve as a helpful reminder to the church that people don't want to simply consume the services that we offer. Rather, many people want to participate by being involved in creating their own content, as well as by sharing and affirming the initiatives that other people make. In the research that I did on COVID, lots of church leaders told me about how they'd participated in the Great New Zealand or Great Australian Bear Hunt, including by using bears to tell the Easter story, and that was great. But even if the content of an Easter story hadn't been played out by the teddy bears, the joy and participation by numerous people, Christian or not, built a really important sense of solidarity and brought hope. It said, you're not alone, we're in this together. And I believe that God was at work through those bears and through the people who helped to tell their stories. So that's my first story, some bears. Many bears all over the country. My second story is from one of the 3 churches that I did a lot of research with. So I sent out a survey, and about 75 church leaders from Australia and New Zealand completed this online survey. And then I went and with 3 churches, I looked at them in lots of detail. I looked at all of their church services. I interviewed their leaders and people who went to the church to try to understand what was happening during the early stage of COVID and how they supported wellbeing. And one of the churches told me about an initiative that they'd done where they invited everybody in the church to reach out to 3 people, not just once, but regularly. So they said, everybody, this is really tough. This season that we're in is hard, and we're going to get through this. And one of the ways that we're going to get through this is by each of us choosing 3 people and committing to making regular contact with them, committing to being in touch with them on a regular basis. Now, for some, those 3 people were people within the church, and for others, they were people outside the church. So this had obvious benefits for the people who were checked in with. Okay, you've got someone who's ringing you and checking that you're okay, asking how you're doing, seeing if you need anything, making sure if you do need some help getting groceries, you've got someone to link you up with that. So that's obviously helpful for the people who were contacted. but it was also helpful for the people who offered that care and support. It gave the person who was making the call a sense of purpose, that they were doing something that was important and something that was valued and valuable. It built a sense of connection and attachment to others, not only to the person that they were caring for, but also to the church as a whole, because we were doing this together, the church community thought. We're in this together. Together, we're supporting one another in this way. So relationships deepen between the caregiver and the care receiver, but the caregiver also saw it as making an important contribution to the life of the church and to the wider community. And then the third benefit was that it enhanced a sense of kind of what they call personal agency or autonomy. There was something that the caregiver was actually something that they could do in a time when we all felt pretty helpless and didn't really know what we could do and how we could help. This provided a way of actually doing something that, again, was seen to be worthwhile and valuable. They could decide to act in a way that was helpful and caring towards others, giving some sense of control over their actions, when in many ways our control had been lost and was lacking. So that's my second story of a church that said to everyone, hey, let's reach out to 3 people, not once, but many times, not just to people in the church, but to people we know beyond the church as well. And then my third story, this is a gingham tablecloth, because I couldn't find a picture that captured what I wanted it to show. So that's just a tablecloth. But I'd like you to imagine maybe if we took all the chairs out of this building and we put tables down and tablecloths and we put food on the tables and seats around it and just opened a space for people. Just imagine that with that red and white gingham tablecloth, because that's the picture I have in my head as I tell you this story. This is the story of Olivia, who was one of the women that I interviewed as part of my PhD, looking at why previously unchurched people were becoming Christians. Olivia's mother was really, 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 really anti-God and anti-Christianity, anti-religion. And when Olivia was a child, she wasn't allowed to go to anything that was run by Christians or the church. So she had to leave whenever there was Bible in schools in her school. She wasn't allowed to be in the classroom, and she just wasn't allowed near Christians. Not entirely sure of the mother's logic for that. But there was one exception. She was allowed to go to a secular choir, because it was a secular choir. But at that choir, the repertoire that they sang included some songs that were religious. And so as Olivia used to sing these songs, she sensed something different about some of the people singing with her. She thought that she could see that they believed what they were singing. And she thought about the people who had written those songs and thought they really had something that they could write these songs and tell a story of faith. And so she sensed that God was somehow there in the midst of it. And the songs left her wondering. And years later, she started teaching in a Catholic school. And one day she walked past, just before Easter, she walked past this notice board, and there were all these pictures on it that the kids had coloured in. And they said, there was a picture of a cross with somebody on it, and it said, he died for our sins. And she's going, I have no idea what that means. What on earth does that mean? But look, there's this wall of posters that all say the same thing. So it's obviously really important to the school that I teach at. And so she became more curious. She thought, I want to be a good teacher in this school. And so I think if I want to be a good teacher, I need to understand what that means. And so she decided that she'd go to church so she could learn more. She got on the internet, because that's what young people do these days, and identified 2 possible churches that met the criteria that she'd set. And here's the criteria that she set. It had an evening service, because she liked to sleep in on a Sunday morning. There were young people that she could get to know. It wasn't too traditional or institutionalised, and there were older people who would offer wisdom and experience, and they were her criteria, and she identified these 2 churches near to her. And then 10 minutes later, a university friend texted and invited her to church, and the university friend invited her to one of those 2 churches that she had identified. That's quite cool, I think, that God was at work in Olivia's life and in the life of Olivia's friend, prompting her to contact her at that moment and invite her to church. Now, Olivia reckons that churches have an image problem because what she got was certainly not what she was expecting. She said it was a short, relaxed service with music that appealed to her, and it was followed by a fundraising dinner where information was shared about an upcoming missions trip. People were welcoming and kind. There was a cost for the meal, which was the fundraiser for the missions trip, and her friend had made the meal donation on Olivia's behalf, which just amazed her, blew her away. And there was a sense of community that Olivia found remarkable. She told me this. She said, "And so it was dinner with everyone, which was really nice. Like I literally didn't think that kind of thing happened in real life. It's kind of the thing that you'd see on the TV show Seventh Heaven or something. And I'd just look at them having dinner when I was watching TV and think, that doesn't happen, does it? Like all in community, eating together at the little tables with the little tablecloths." And she said, "It was so unusual to me to eat a meal like that with the community because I've never experienced that type of community before. And people were so welcoming, even though they didn't know me, and they were making donations to dinner, but my friend had known what they were doing and paid that for me. And so that was massively kind of my friend, and it was just kind and friendly and warm and welcoming, and sort of a real surprise that there could be this sense of community where I had never really felt any before." And so that's Olivia. Olivia, who experienced in a church community a sense of community and warmth and love like she'd never experienced before. She used to barely eat with her family for meals, so eating together in community was new to her and unusual. And eventually, as you may have gathered, she became a Christian herself. Okay, so 3 stories, and now just a little bit about pastoral care. I want to talk about pastoral care very briefly as being holistic, liberating, provided by many, and as a result, missional. I don't know if you're familiar with the Te Whare Tapawhā model of well-being, which Sir Mason Dury wrote about in 1985, trying to come up with a way of thinking about health for Māori that was holistic and not just physically based. According to Mason Dury, holistic well-being can be likened to a whare, a simple house or hut. A whare has 4 equally essential walls. If you take one wall away, you no longer have a functioning house. And holistic well-being is Te Whare Tapawhā, a house of 4 walls, comprising spiritual, social, mental, and physical well-being. And each of those aspects is equally and interconnectedly essential. If you take one of them away, you no longer have a functioning person. So such an understanding, applied to pastoral care, invites churches to be attentive to the whole person, as well as recognising the interconnections that exist between the various aspects of well-being. Sees people as embodied, and it also invites us to be attentive to persons beyond the self, to seeing people embedded in social contexts and an ecological context. And in so many ways, this sort of idea isn't new, because throughout the scriptures we see an understanding of the person as much more holistic and integrated than we tend to see people as in our Western concept today, where we might go to the doctor and deal with our physical health, or we might see someone to help with our mental health, but we don't tend to see it integrated and whole. And I think we need to engage in pastoral care and ways of caring for people that are attentive to each of those aspects of well-being, and to be asking, how can we help people improve their physical well-being? How can we help people improve their spiritual well-being, their mental well-being, and their social well-being? And churches have a wonderful role to play in each of those spaces. The second aspect of pastoral care is that pastoral care should be liberating. It should work to tackle, to respond to injustice. It should extend beyond the individual towards liberation. It should engage in things like, supporting a home for young mums who need a bit of help. It's liberative. It's helping people to, not just in their own individual lives, but also beyond that, to find the freedom and the hope and the restoration and the healing that they need, which may involve some challenging of some structures, that may involve some changing some systems to make sure that people can flourish. So it works towards justice. And then pastoral care is also provided by many. Sometimes we think of pastoral care as something that the minister provides to the congregation. And that can be an important part of pastoral care, the sort of specialist care that the minister and only the minister might be able to provide. But increasingly we are seeing pastoral care in terms of partnership, and that there are many caring partners. Peggy Way, who's an American professor, writes about this. She argues that care is a human and not a professional function. So you don't suddenly become caring after you've gone to theological college and become a minister. You're caring because you're a human person who is inherently built, designed, created to care for others. And so just as our need for care is inevitable from infancy through all of life, so too our provision of care ought to be inevitable. She says to become human is to be expected, invited, and able to offer care. And so she's helpfully extending who does the care beyond the minister, acknowledging that lay people collaborate in pastoral care in all sorts of ways, both in terms of that one-on-one pastoral care, in terms of creating systems that help with the holistic well-being of people, and in terms of challenging and liberating and bringing hope and freedom to people as they need it. And then the other thing that she notes is the reciprocal nature of care. So she notes that those who offer care are those who need to receive it, and those who receive care are gifted in offering it. So that sense that as we give, we are actually receiving as well, and there's benefits for us, strength for us, blessings for us in our giving because of what we receive as well. And so pastoral care can no longer be seen as being the sole domain of ordained people. We're all called to offer pastoral care. And if we think about the holistic and liberating emphasis, then that call to pastoral care is a call to partner in God's redemption and healing of the world, and therefore is a missional thing. Part of participating in the good that God is doing in the world to bring about God's kingdom here. And so a missional perspective sees pastoral care and mission as inseparable, not as two things that we look at as separate items, but as things that happen at the same time. If we take that back to some theological ideas, we might think about the relationality of the Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, who are in relationship together, and see the church and Christians as made to image that relationality that God expresses in the Trinity. And also, just as the Father sent Jesus, so Jesus sent us into the world to care for all, towards the flourishing of all. those within and those beyond the church. So it's a call towards holistic well-being that sometimes requires a liberating dimension as oppressed peoples and systems and structures are dealt with and people are empowered. And it's a call for all, not just for ordained clergy, and it's inherently missional. And so what do we learn? The context of decline, of declining religious affiliation, reminds us that the world is different today than it was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. And that reminds us that the forms and practices of the past are not all that is required into the future. It also reminds us that pastoral care needs to extend beyond the church, because back when 90% of people were affiliated with church and in church, we could do pastoral care in the church and everybody would be cared for, just about. But now, if more than half of people aren't in church, if we want to care for people, if we want to care for everybody, we need to be caring for people beyond the church. The teddy bears remind us that there's good things that are already happening out there in our big wide world, and that we can be invited to join in and participate with those. We don't always need to be initiating things. We don't always need to be doing things in our church for others. The teddy bears also remind us that people don't always want to be consumers. They also want to create and to contribute and to enhance and to bless others. The story I told about reaching out from from one of the churches that I interviewed reminds us that we can often see our actions in terms of the benefits for the recipients of care, but in reality they also benefit the person who's doing the caring. There's reciprocity, the benefits go both ways. And again, there's an invitation to make appropriate space for people to be caregivers as well as recipients of care. That story reminds us that pastoral care can happen informally. In fact, it primarily happens informally, with referrals as needed. And everything that churches do, meeting together like this is part of pastoral care, isn't it? Where you come together and you can chat and catch up, share concerns, share ideas, share letters from Naira, and have that sense of being part of something, and of having opportunities to connect with one another and to see who's doing okay and who might appreciate a cup of tea one-on-one. And the story of Olivia reminds us of the importance of and the opportunity for intergenerational relationships. Olivia wanted to be in a church community where there were older people because of the wisdom and experience that they bring. And that's pretty cool, I think. Opportunity for intergenerational relationships. Olivia's story reminds us too that people do still become Christians today. Sometimes it can get a little bit depressing, I think. We're kind of thinking, the numbers are going down, not so many people might have come back to church after COVID. Things can seem a bit gloomy. Olivia's story reminds us people do still come to faith. People do still find a relationship with God. Her story also reminds us that eating together is really important in safe, COVID-safe ways, of course. But that sense of participating, of sharing a meal together is something that is really important. It also reminds us that people have really different experiences of growing up. And our own experiences of loving families, perhaps, our own experiences with our children, if we have them, our own experiences with our grandchildren. Other people have different experiences, and so we need to be aware of that, and also we can invite others into good and healthy family relationships as well. And so that's really what I wanted to share with you today, to hopefully encourage you with some stories about God being at work in our world, about teddy bears and the joy that they bring and the way that we can participate in that and invite others to participate as well. About pastoral care being everything that we do that is caring towards one another. and to the joy that can be given and received as a result of that. And an invitation to remember, to see pastoral care as being holistic, about all of the person, liberating when necessary, taking on systems of injustice, taking on addressing things that need to be addressed. Provided by many, by each of us, caring for one another and for others. And being inherently missional, because as we participate in God, as we live into the purposes of God, we are not only caring for those within our church, but we're also expressing love and care for others beyond our church as well. So that's what I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynne. I first met you through the OUT and an article that you'd written on pastoral care. And I immediately felt something to write to you. And the thing that I thought was true to what you said about being a practical theologian is that I immediately got a response. I didn't get an automated reply that said your call is important to us and could you wait a priority line number 37. I got a very warm response, and since that time we've had interesting dialogue through the email. So thank you very much. It's 3 stories. They've resounded with me, and I can feel that within our church I can identify examples of those 3 messages that you've given. And especially, I'll always think of Judy. I'll always think of you as a red tablecloth now. We've got somebody in our congregation who's just been created church meals for people eating together and to share that pastoral care. Now, our small gift for you this afternoon, excuse me, but not walk anywhere with that, is some food that you can go further and share.
Thank you.
With people. So please thank Lynne and prepare your questions, because there's probably some questions from the group that you would like to ask. Yes.
Thank you, Lynne. Your statistics reminded me of the Southern District Health Board sent out their statistics when, in the context of preparing a new chapel for the new hospital, they sent the statistics back to those who put out the petition, it must be a Christian chapel. And that group of 60 church leaders got the statistics saying, well, actually this new space, the majority of people using it will be spiritual but not religious. This is tracking down, and it's going to continue to track down. So one of the practical implications of that reduction is our new hospital chapel will be a spiritual centre, predominantly for people of no religion. And so the last couple of years I've been on the group planning that, and it's going to be different to the current chapel because New Zealand is different today, and therefore the secular plans that are funding that project instruct those who are on the committee to design it appropriately. But that leads to considerable tension with those who would still like the church to be 95%. So I just wondered if you had anything to say about how we manage that tension between those who long for the past and those who must, build for the future. As Christians still, but alongside a lot of people who, like Olivia's mum, want nothing at all to do with the church.
Yeah, that's a great comment and question, Greg, thanks. one of my wise friends talks about, or asks the question, is something I can't remember exactly, the gist is it a problem or is it a condition? And so is it a problem that can be solved or is it a condition that we're in? And I think that the church has fought very hard often, against this declining religiosity, and sees it as a problem that could be solved if only something, I'm not sure what, but if only something. And I think there's now an invitation to say, okay, that's not actually a problem that we can solve because we're only human and it's not our problem to solve. This is a condition that we're in. This is the situation we find ourselves in. So how do we live well within that? If there is this decreasing affiliation with Christian faith and an increasing no religion, and yet this very strong residual commitment to spirituality, then how do we live into that? How do we respond to that? And so I hope that the new hospital chapel will have resources that enhance people's spirituality. And I trust and believe in a big God and a good God who is at work in the lives of people, drawing them towards God's self in ways that are beyond our understanding, and in ways that are invitational and wonderful. So I hope that, we will begin to see things as a condition that we're in rather than always as a problem that we can somehow solve.
You will be invited to the opening in 8 years' time.
Excellent, I'll be there.
Lynne, you mentioned spirituality. As a health professional, we are bound now to ask people about their spirituality, but I think health professionals do it in such an awkward fashion that often the person doesn't realise what they're being asked and quickly. Are you involved in looking at any way and sort of educating health professionals on how to ask people about their spiritual connections or how they would like to be dealt with pastorally in the healthcare system?
That's a good question. So I was previously, until Graham Reading was appointed as our lecturer in chaplaincy studies, I did a lot of teaching into our chaplaincy qualification, which meant that I was working with chaplains on that question, but I'm not working with healthcare professionals more generally there. But one of the things that I taught and learnt, because teaching is all about also learning so much from our students who are so amazing, was around, what sort of questions can you ask that actually get at that in ways that are going to be comfortable and meaningful for people. And so I think often chaplains have a set of questions that they might ask, and they're kind of gauging what question might be most appropriate to the person that is before them, and then they're perhaps asking, more than one to elicit the sort of information that might be helpful. So questions about what gives you a sense of, meaning and purpose. What do you love to do? What brings you joy? And you can ask, are you involved with the church? And then if the answer is no, then you open up to some other questions around meaning, purpose, joy, hope, etc. Yeah. Have you got other things that you would add to that? And Greg, have you got other things that you would add to that, or others?
It worries me. I know at the bottom of a lot of the health consent forms now, are there any spiritual or cultural considerations we need to take into account? And there's a box, yes, no. And it's dealt with as quickly as that. And I worry that a lot of people quickly say no for the fear that they're going to get a visit from the minister. And I think we have to help health professionals deal with this more, sensitively, openly, whatever.
Appropriately, yeah.
Just a quick story. There was a Muslim man in Dunedin Hospital
Yeah, and requires those good relationships between nursing staff and chaplaincy team and that as well. Yep.
But equally, the man got the help he needed and
Hello.
recovered a lot more quickly as a result.
Well, no one's asked a question.
Excellent.
You can't hold the mic. One of the mics. Yes, mind your toes.
I'm on my toes.
That would not be good.
That would
pastoral
not be
care.
good, no.
Just a teensy bit closer, I'm at the limit.
I prevalently. One of your stories talked about the churches getting a bad press, and certainly that's true. I mean, you only need to read newspapers about abuse and all sorts of things. But I was astounded when I came into Dunedin. I came down here for 3 months, 41 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I came down to have psychiatric treatment at Ashburn Clinic for depression. And when I asked if they had any kind of chaplaincy program there, their answer was no, they didn't have any chaplaincy because it was a confidentiality issue.
Hmm.
And I found that extraordinary.
Hmm.
That Christian chaplains were less trustworthy than any of the doctors or nurses that were employed there.
Yeah, that is interesting, isn't it? Those policies that can be cause barriers to people actually wanting to receive care. Yeah, and does require again that really good working together with chaplains, with the organisations and that they're working into. Yeah, I hope that would be a bit different now. I don't know.
I would hope, but I'm not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. Yeah, I mean there is a lot of difference between different agencies, isn't there, and different care providers. But I think that chaplaincy is certainly a growing area of ministry that's recognised within the healthcare system and within other agencies as well. So I think increasingly there is that acceptance and desire for or recognition that people do have spiritual needs that chaplains can help to care for.
Well, the whole basis of that being clear was on holistic treatment.
Right. Or not entirely holistic treatment, perhaps.
Just as an aside to that, it strikes me that when you get healthcare, you meet the health professional and then you consent to whether or not you're going to go ahead with what they offer. But with a spiritual carer, you have to consent before you meet them, which seems an unusual way to me to go about it.
And again, I think there'll be difference within the different district health boards around that, around those, how that works, which will be interesting to see what happens with the new health model now, which way it will go in terms of systems. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Now, if you can just gather quietly and discuss things, we're going to share after tea. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Check one.
Loud and clear.
Check 1 2. Check 1 2.
Yep.
like a nice quick.